Hi, hello everybody. Unfortunately, I am not Rakhshanda Jalil. I would love to be her. She's extremely beautiful, extremely glamorous, and speaks so well, but it shall remain an unfulfilled ambition. So you've got me, but Rakhshanda got stuck. The flight didn't take off. So I'm filling in and delighted to welcome you all to this discussion with Sara on her really wonderful memoir, Raw Umber, which in many ways goes back several years to an old home, an old life, an old ancestry, and a very interestingly mixed ancestry that is not only located in Allahabad, but moves back and forth between Allahabad, Varanasi, Delhi, Australia, and various other places. So we're going to talk about this book. And Sara, welcome, and thank you for being here. So let me start by asking you to actually just tell us a little about the memoir. What were you trying to do in it?
Yeah, I mean, these things die out on me, but this one is working, so look, it's all right. Well, actually, the memoir was not written as a memoir to begin with. I mean, this has been going on for a long time. It felt like I was always writing it because, like, we have the habit of scribbling. So I've been writing in my journals and diaries forever, since I can't remember since when. So some of these essays or chapters, whatever you call them, they started way back, especially the two chapters on my father. They were written when he was still alive, which is about 30 years ago or something like that. And they were all in one big thing called All About My Father, but I split them up later into two things. So this has been going on for a long time, and it was never really intended to be seen. I was writing it for myself. It was a kind of scribbling that one tends to do, which is what we do. It's like, I mean, what would we do if we didn't scribble? So it was like that. But then when I had, say, about 3 or 4 essays done, I thought, why not make it into a book? So it was a kind of serendipity that the book happened. It was not intended as a book when I started.
So were you, it's difficult, Sara, to talk to you as a writer without mentioning the very august lineage you come from. So I think everybody in this audience knows about Sara's lineage, but if you don't, she is the granddaughter of Prem Chand, the Hindi writer who has figured in all our textbooks and so on in school. When you come from that kind of lineage, how do you dare to write? One thing. So what was the shadow looming over you? What was the encouragement looming over you? And although Prem Chand has been so much talked about, your grandmother, less so. So can you talk a little bit about belonging to that lineage, what it meant to you as a writer?
Well, to start with, I mean, obviously I'm very proud of him. I'm sort of, but also, I mean, this feeling of pride comes with a sense of embarrassment, because in school, when I was a shy child, and every year there'd be a story by Prem Chand in the textbook. And then the teacher would say, that's her grandfather who wrote this story. And I would shrink. And when term started, I saw that this chapter is there in the book and I'm going to be pointed out. So like I shrank right from the beginning of term, even when the story wasn't being taught. So anyway, so it was a kind of mixed blessing, I would say, that he was there. And of course, he was there in the sense of a looming figure. I mean, he shaped my sensibility, I would say. He shaped the sensibility of the entire family. So it was more like that. It was hardly, I mean, obviously I knew I can't write like him and I can never be such a wonderful, popular writer. But, I mean, the writing happened, I think. I mean, our whole family got attuned to the idea of writing because he was this figure, And also his values that were transmitted, for instance, that money is a bad thing. So when someone asked me when I was a child, about 8 or 9 years old, like people do, what will you do? What will you be when you grow up? So I said, I want to be poor. So because I thought that was an ideal, that this is something good, because it's somehow spiritually exalting to be poor, and money is a bad thing, it corrupts, which largely I believe even today, but obviously one needs the money and one does want money. But this is how we grew up, and there were all these things, so a sense of values that was being inherited by us from him.
And what about your grandmother's influence?
My grandmother, actually, she was a very domineering woman. She sort of controlled Premchand. So she was, someone called her Premchand's dictator because she was very tiny, a small woman. So was he, actually. He was not tall. He was also a small man. But she would really sort of almost bully him, I would say. And she was sort of the one who looked after everything and gave him the space to be able to write. And she was also a writer herself, actually, which people did not realize. And she also, because when she wrote a couple of stories and had them published without showing them to him, people thought that it was he who had written them and just published them in her name. So he came back and said, "What is this? Why didn't you tell me?" And it was so embarrassing for me, and people thought that I had written it. So, but then he wrote a note saying that these stories cannot possibly have been written by me, because they have the tone of a yodhastri, which is a warrior woman. So I can't possibly have written them. These are not by me. So anyway, she wrote a fair amount of stories, and then she wrote a memoir of him, a biography of him called Premchand Ghar Mein. So in that biography, she completely erases herself, which is completely like...
Yeah, which is not unusual.
Yeah, so it's like a triple erasure, because firstly she's a woman, then she's a woman writer, then she's Premchand's wife. So she herself gets erased in this, and we only get to know about her life as a kind of glancing thing, sort of on the side. She says something about herself. So, for instance, we don't know her date of birth. I know her date of death, obviously, because it happened before me. But I mean, when she was born, what she did, what her childhood was like, we know nothing. And she was a child widow. And she was, I think, may have been 11 or 12 years old when she was widowed for the first time. And then, of course, she was widowed a second time when my grandfather died, and she survived him by 40 years. And she was a very strong woman with very clear, very definite political views also, and she was part of his entire political life, because for him and her, for both of them, the personal and the political were completely sort of merged together. What they did in their life was also what was happening in the country.
So Sara, talking so much about your grandmother as a writer and the strong woman that she was, this memoir, Raw Umber, first of all, the title, where does that come from?
Okay. The title actually is, Raw Umber is a color. My father was a painter, and he was fond of the color raw umber. So he used it quite a lot. And raw umber also is it comes from umbra, which means shadow. In Latin, it means shadow. And my father was a very shadowy figure. He was not, he wouldn't come out. He was very introspective and very, not an extrovert. He was an introverted person. And so it was, and it also comes from colors of the earth. Raw umber is also the color of the earth. So there were these nuances in that color for me. And since the book was primarily, it was going to be more about my father than anyone else, and which is why there are 2 chapters on him. And he also figures in my writing chapter, the one that I've written about how I came to writing. So my father figures very prominently in that. So I thought the color that he used, and it kind of symbolized him in some ways.
It's a very intriguing title, and it's not until you're like halfway through the book when you start to talk about your father's painterly life as opposed to his writerly life that you actually come across that. But the entire home, the picture that you paint of a life gone by, a home and a family that was so intertwined in multiple traditions, and therefore having access not only to different forms of language, but different cultures of living, different rituals, different kinds of poetry. Can you talk a little bit about that? What role did that play in shaping your identity as a writer?
Well, actually, I grew up with this very mixed lineage, because my mother came from a Shia aristocratic family of Banaras, and we lived in a very old Haveli. I mean, this was the Haveli that had been inhabited by my mother's family for the last 200 or 300 years, quite a long time. And my father came from being Premchand's son. He was from the village, and he came from this very kind of secular Hindu background, I would say. I mean, we were never which I feel as a loss sometimes now, we were never told, like when grandmothers tell their children stories when they are small, we were never told stories from the Mahabharata or Ramayana or the Puran or, or from the Quran or any religious text. So it was a completely secular background. Now I feel that perhaps I would have liked them to tell me something from those, because they are basically sources of literature. They are primary sources of literature. So you're deprived of those things. But since we had this very sort of, and because of the Hindu-Muslim marriage also, I think my parents made some kind of pact that nobody would talk about their religion to the children. So with with the result that we grew up in this entirely secular home. And influences, because there were all these languages. My father was a fluent Bangla speaker. He loved speaking Bangla. And he spoke to his mother in Bhojpuri. And there was the Awadhi that was locally spoken in Allahabad. In school, there was a very strict English, because we had German nuns who taught us English, and they were very particular about the enunciation of particular words and all that. And Hindi, of course, Hindustani, Urdu, Farsi. My grandmother spoke a very chaste Urdu, which she could also, which could slide into this very abusive kind of uninhibited abuse also when she felt like it. So that was there. And there was constantly talk about languages in the house. Like if a word would come up in a conversation which people didn't understand or unusual word, immediately dictionaries would be brought out. And there were 4 or 5 dictionaries in the house. Bangla, Hindi, Urdu, Farsi, all these dictionaries were there. And they would be brought out and the word would be checked at once. What is this new word? So there was this constant preoccupation with language, correct language, or, anything. Like my mother, my mother and my aunt, they were my 2 mothers, I call them. They were sort of very much into Urdu poetry also. So they even found fault with Faiz ki Urdu, He said, ये वो पंजाब का है, वो तो नहीं बोल सकता, and खाक, क्या खाक में नहलाए हुए होना चाहिए, वो खाक में लिथड़े हुए कहते हैं. खाक में लिथड़े is like, sort of, because it's something wet, but खाक is dry. So you can be bathed in dust, but you cannot be, it's not a wet thing. So they found little things like that. And they said, his Urdu has this Punjabi inflection and stuff like that, So they were very purist kind of people. And they spoke this very, very correct, very chaste Urdu. So there's this constant preoccupation with language, I would say, in my...
So that comes through, of course, for you in your work and your identity as a writer, because language is something you negotiate and it means a lot to you. And you have written in Hindi short stories. So I remember your book, Abba Bil Ki Udan, which years ago I read, which I really loved. But, and you chose to write the memoir in English. So can you talk a little bit about language and what that means to you, how you choose the form and the language?
Yeah, well, when I was writing my stories, this whole thing with language goes back also to my father, because when I was growing up and sort of trying to understand or sort of make a choice between which language I would write in, because I was fluent in both, my father said that creative writing can only be done in one's mother tongue. So that heavy statement sort of stayed with me. And since I could write and speak quite easily in English, because after all, my education had been in English. But when he said that, I sort of went to Hindi, and I sort of hadn't read much Hindi in school, because we had a very basic kind of Hindi in school. I was not reading literature in Hindi. So when he said that, I started reading literature, and I began to write in Hindi. And then I realized that this is the language that I would like to write in also, because you can't live in one language and write in another. And we were living with Hindustani all around us, Hindi is being spoken, and also there was a slight feeling of shame, I would say, because our family had this literary pride. So I thought, how can I write in English when I'm Premchand's granddaughter? I can't possibly write in English. So this sort of up and down seesawing went on for a long time. It's still going on. And it took me a long time to sort of realize that one language doesn't really cancel out the other. You can write in both, So I started writing. And when I wrote my memoir in English, because all my fiction has been in Hindi, all my short story collections, my novel, everything is in Hindi, or Hindustani as I like to call it. And when I wrote this in English, I had sort of realized that when you're writing about fiction, about things that you see around you, you're looking at things through the lens of Hindi. I mean, it's being woven on the loom of Hindi, rather. And when I try to frame what I'm thinking about and what I'm thinking about writing, or about my own life, or about myself, my sensibility has been shaped by what I've read in English. So somehow, since this raw Umber was about me and my life and my writing, it's just, English seemed to be the more sort of appropriate language to write it in.
Okay, do we do questions in this? Yes? So I'm going to ask you one more question, then open it up. We have still 10 minutes. My last question to you, Sara, is about how you explore memory and how you explore the sort of, how you very carefully in raw umber navigate between what can easily turn into nostalgia and how you explore the shifting nature of memory. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Actually, while sort of writing, I've come to realize that memory is not just cerebral memory. When you sit down to write, your whole body kind of comes into play. I mean, your hands have a different memory, your eyes have a different memory, your ears listen to something. So it's a physical memory that is also at play, which sort of absorbs the sensuousness, the sensual nature of things around you, and that enters into your writing. So when I was writing, this occurred to me, and also that when you are writing, a piece of writing is not just a visual, something that you're reading, it is also auditory. I mean, you are also listening to what you're writing. You know, so all these factors come into play when you're sitting down to write a piece of fiction. So that's what happens. And memory, somehow my childhood recall was much clearer to me than my later recall. People have asked me, why haven't you written about your later life? And I've said, probably I'm getting Alzheimer's or something. I just remember my childhood much better than my later years. So it's all about the shaping of my sensibility when I was a child and all the things that went into it, and it's stuff like that.
I think that last bit where you talk about memory being not merely cerebral, but felt on the body, felt in the skin, I think that's a really beautiful sort of thing. It comes through quite in a quite lovely way in the memoir, where you move between, I don't know which one can say that, literature and memory, or reflections on memory and the actual memory of it.